The steel yards along both coasts hummed with a rhythm the world had never heard before. Men in hard hats wielded torches that threw blue light across half-finished hulls. And somewhere in the background, sirens wailed as the world tore itself apart. It had taken 5 long years to arrive at this moment, the final chapter of destroyer evolution before everything changed. When the last guns of World War I fell silent, the treaty system rose from the ashes, imposing limits that shaped every warship for nearly 2 decades. Now, as Hitler's armies marched and imperial fleets prepared for war, those treaties were nothing more than ghosts, forgotten in the rush to build something faster, deadlier, more capable than anything that had come before. Some navies had been quietly ignoring those old restrictions for years, building ships that laughed in the face of tonnage limits and gun counts. Others scrambled to catch up, their designers hunched over drafting tables late into the night, smoking cigarettes and sketching lines that would become steel. The treaty era was dead, but understanding its collapse took time. And by the middle of the 1930s, some nations still clung to fragments of those old rules, hoping others might follow their example. Politics mixed with practicality because smaller destroyers were cheaper, and when your economy was still recovering from the last war, that mattered. Then came September 1939, and the shooting started. The effect on destroyer design was immediate and brutal. In some places, development froze completely, not because of lack of ideas, but because factories turned to mass production of ships already proven in service, churning out hulls that would keep the sea lanes open or die trying. Other nations found themselves in circumstances so desperate that even when designs existed, the shipyards couldn't build them. Steel and skilled labor diverted elsewhere or simply obliterated by enemy bombs. These never-built destroyers haunt the pages of naval archives, ships that existed only as blueprints and dreams. In other yards, new designs did hit the water, but they reflected something darker, the understanding that quantity mattered more than perfection, that you needed hulls in the water now, not flawless warships 5 years from now. The destroyer that slid down the ways in 1939 and the destroyer commissioned in 1945 were vessels from different worlds, shaped by lessons written in blood across every ocean. The French Marine Nationale had been building the Mogador-class contre-torpilleurs and the Le Hardy-class torpilleurs when the world started falling apart. Through the late 1930s, they'd watched the Spanish Civil War with growing horror as aircraft proved they could kill warships, and that changed everything. The Le Hardy carried just one twin 37mm mount for anti-aircraft defense, which everyone suddenly realized was laughably inadequate. The solution seemed obvious: give destroyers dual-purpose main guns that could engage aircraft and surface targets with equal effectiveness. The original 8-ship program expanded to 12, and while the first batch was too far along to modify, engineers thought they could adapt the last 4 ships with the same dual-purpose mounts used on the Dunkirk-class battleships. The problem was weight. Those mountings were heavy. The magazines needed to be larger to hold anti-aircraft shells alongside conventional rounds. And if you wanted to maintain speed, range, and stability, the ships would have to grow considerably larger. Larger hulls needed more powerful machinery, and once you'd gone that far, you might as well reconsider the entire armament layout. Options included 3 twin 130mm mounts, with an additional twin 100mm, 4 twin 100mm mounts, or even 4 twin 130mm mounts. Some designers wanted light armor to protect the bridge and main battery from strafing attacks, though that would cost them a torpedo tube, and force a reduction in light anti-aircraft guns from 37mm down to 23mm weapons. They settled on the first option: 3 twins with an additional twin 100mm mount, and 3 of the 4 additional Le Hardy were reordered to this specification, while the last would be built to the original design. Then France fell. The idea briefly resurfaced in Vichy, France, with yet another modified design, fractionally slower, but carrying a heavier medium anti-aircraft battery with considerably more 37mm guns and fewer torpedoes. Issues with the 130mm dual-purpose mountings led to proposals to swap them for twin 100mm types. But before this went anywhere, the Germans decided they were taking over the rest of France in 1942, and French destroyer development died until the T-47 class rose from the post-war ruins. The contre-torpilleur line had ended even earlier. Just before the war, planners decided to build a third Mogador, because the Marine Nationale preferred operating destroyers in 3 ship divisions, then follow up with 3 improved ships often called the Deadliest, after the proposed lead ship's name. These would have longer range and better agility than the Mogadors, which wouldn't be difficult since some battleships turned tighter circles than those ships. The most obvious change was swapping the aft torpedo tubes for a pair of twin 100mm anti-aircraft guns and a few more heavy machine guns. And since the ships would now only have 1 set of torpedo tubes, provision was made to carry reloads. This added weight up high, and ongoing issues with the heavier 138.5mm main guns led to proposals to switch them to the same 130mm dual-purpose mountings considered for the follow-on Le Hardy. Everything paused when war broke out, then briefly restarted in spring 1940 with more changes. Switching to 130mm dual-purpose guns was confirmed. The 100mm guns were deleted and replaced by an array of 37mm guns, and ideas emerged to develop this redesign further with a program tentatively titled Type 1940. The fall of France a couple months later stopped all work permanently. The Soviet Union's destroyer story was mostly about trying to finish ships already on the slipways when the Germans invaded. But there was one program of new ships that emerged from a uniquely Soviet problem. When you declare actual qualifications in ship design and construction to be a bourgeois concept, then execute or exile everyone with such paperwork as enemies of the state, building complex warships becomes difficult. The original idea had been to take Tashkent, which had been mostly built in Italy, and build 3 more such ships in Soviet yards. It turned out that building a big, capable, complex destroyer like Tashkent, with what remained of the Soviet shipbuilding industry after the most recent purges, was essentially impossible. This idea was cancelled, and instead they decided to build a smaller vessel. Though at just under 2,400 tons standard displacement, it was still fairly substantial. Then, in a move that defied logic, they decided to fit an even heavier armament than Tashkent on a considerably smaller hull, while somehow maintaining Tashkent's blisteringly high top speed. They kept the 3 twin 130mm guns, but added a pair of 76mm anti-aircraft guns and swapped the 3 triple torpedo launchers for 2 quintuple torpedo launchers, a net gain of 1 torpedo. They hoped to build 30 of these ships, though only 15 were ordered, and 3 were laid down before the Germans invaded. 1 was scrapped on the slipway, and the other 2 were launched incomplete and towed away from the front lines where they stayed for the rest of the war. Officially dubbed Project 48, a revised Project 48K design was drawn up after the war that at least acknowledged the need for a larger hull. But this project also died, and the hulls were used as targets. The resulting class is sometimes known as the Kiev class, and Projects 35 and 40, other large destroyers with dual-purpose main guns, were drawn up mid-war, but never progressed to even having a keel plate laid. The Regia Marina started building the Soldati class before the war began, with its pair of twin 120mm gun mounts and 2 triple torpedo launchers continuing the design lineage that had started with the Navigatori years earlier. A second batch of Soldatis were laid down during the war with a few changes. The short-barrel 120mm Star Shell gun amidships was replaced by a 5th full-size 120mm gun, and the anti-aircraft battery was upgraded from heavy machine guns to numerous 20mm cannon. Some ships of both batches had their aft torpedo tubes replaced by 37mm anti-aircraft guns, and radar was brought in on some ships as a mid-war modification. The plan was to supersede them with a larger type, the Comandante Medaglia d'Oro class, which pushed displacement over the 2,000-ton mark to 2,100 tons standard. This was primarily designed to buy increased range and better sustained top speed, as previous Italian destroyers had often achieved very high sprint speeds on trials, and occasionally in service, but couldn't sustain them long-term. The main armament remained at 4 guns, common to pretty much all Italian destroyer designs at the time, but these were upscaled to 135mm guns, mounted singly instead of in twin mounts. Italy would become unique among the major navies for not embracing dual-purpose main armament. The new emplacements could elevate to 45 degrees, allowing them to provide some cover to other ships much like the 4.7-inch guns on the British Tribal class, but they couldn't defend themselves except maybe against torpedo bombers. Anti-aircraft defense was to come from a dozen single 37mm guns, with the Italian standard 2 triple torpedo launchers providing anti-ship firepower. A modified design was prepared for a second batch of ships, which added another 135mm mount aft and consolidated the light and medium anti-aircraft guns into a pair of quad 37mm guns and another pair of quad 20mm mounts, with sonar and radar also installed. These ships might be seen as broadly similar to the Fletcher-class, but with the first ship not laid down until the end of 1942, none got even close to completion before the Italian armistice in 1943. The Germans had laid down the Type 1936A destroyers before the war, and wartime production for major destroyers started with the second batch of this design. These differed from the originals in being slightly larger overall, having a revised power plant that didn't break down quite as often, and actually mostly being completed with the original planned armament of 1 twin and 3 single 150mm guns, though this wasn't necessarily to their benefit, as even the earlier models with 4 single 150mm guns found this often caused stability and seakeeping issues. Obviously worse when you stuck the additional weight of an extra gun on the front. They were superseded by the Type 1936B, which were unhelpfully being laid down in 1941 and not 1936. These were essentially the Type 1936As, but with revised main armament. Appreciating by this point the ridiculous weight and stability penalties of trying to give an admittedly large destroyer a similar main battery as light cruisers well over twice their displacement, the Type 1936Bs instead went back to the 127mm gun in 5 single mounts. Unfortunately, their anti-aircraft firepower was practically non-existent. The main guns were not dual-purpose. The 37mm medium anti-aircraft guns were the awful bolt-action single-shot SKC-30 types, and although there were no less than 15-20mm cannon in 3 quad and 3 single mounts, these short-range weapons were generally only capable of engaging aircraft after they'd dropped their bombs or launched their torpedoes. 3 out of the 8 ships planned actually entered service. The Type 1936C never entered service. These used the same basic hull design with minimal alterations, but aimed for slightly higher top speed and a heavier main battery using twin mounts for the 127mm guns, with a plan to put one forward and a pair superfiring aft for a total of 6 guns. This was to be a mostly dual-purpose weapon, though sources differ on its maximum elevation, some saying 52 degrees and others 60 degrees, either of which would offer some self-defense capability, but not as much as the better dual-purpose weapons available in other navies. These improvements, which included machinery from abandoned cruisers from the Z plan, pushed standard displacement over 2,600 tons, and another 1,000 tons was added by the time it was fully loaded. Although 2 out of 5 destroyers were laid down, none actually got to the launch stage. The last full-size German destroyer design was the Type 1942, of which only one was ever built, though it too would not enter service. This represented a major shift in German destroyer design. Displacement dropped considerably back to around 2,000 tons standard, with armament initially reduced to 4 single 127mm guns. But design revisions quickly pushed this back up to 3 twins as per the Type 1936Cs. Due to the limited nature of these weapons for anti-aircraft self-defense, Light and medium anti-aircraft batteries were changed to brand new 30mm and 55mm weapons respectively. The single largest change was a switch from steam turbine to diesel propulsion, which would result in a slight loss of speed, but give more than double the operational range, similar endurance to some of the shorter-ranged battleships still around. The lone example, Z-51, was bombed and sunk shortly before the end of the war while still fitting out. There were also the German torpedo boats, and given that they displaced as much or more than some actual destroyers, they deserve coverage. The approximately 1,300-ton Type 1939 or Elbing class carried 4 single 105mm guns along with a pair of triple torpedo launchers. Much like other small German ships in the late 30s and early 40s, their power plants were disappointing, prone to breakdown, slightly underpowered, and very inefficient. Nonetheless, 15 ships were completed, though many more had been planned, and they saw significant active service in the Baltic and North Seas, the English Channel, and off the western coast of France. With much activity came many losses, and 11 out of 15 would be lost, mostly to mines and in surface actions. Only 2 were lost to air attack, both late in the war, possibly because, although small, their main armament was actually dual purpose, which combined with a scattering of 20mm guns gave them respectable anti-aircraft firepower for their size. There were also some bolt-action 37mm guns, mostly for entertainment purposes. The plan was for the next class, the Type 1940, to abandon the pretense of torpedo boat entirely. Projected at over 1,900 tons standard displacement, they were destroyers by pretty much any definition. They were to be armed with 2 quad torpedo launchers and 4 single 127mm guns, plus light and medium anti-aircraft weapons. They were actually a hasty design, rapidly thrown together after the invasion of the Netherlands, to take advantage of materials the Dutch had assembled for their own destroyer program, and the more general perceived capacity of Dutch naval infrastructure now under German control. Although 24 were planned and at least 8 were laid down, it turned out that telling the workforce of a country you just brutally bombed and occupied to now build warships for you was not met with great enthusiasm, and the Dutch workers, at some risk to themselves, engineered the slowest, most protracted, and most painful building program they could think of. The 4 which were actually launched took on average about as long to go from keel laying to launch as the substantially more motivated American workers on the other side of the Atlantic took to get an entire Iowa class from keel laying to launch. The Type 1941 torpedo boat program was more in keeping with the development line from the Type 1939s, at around 1,500 tons standard displacement and of broadly similar armament to those earlier ships. It was hoped that more powerful and hopefully more reliable machinery would make them faster. But the pressures of war meant that of the 15 planned, the first was only laid down in summer 1943, and only 4 of the hulls reached launch status, with 3 surviving the war, but then being scuttled by the Allies soon thereafter. The very last design was the Type 1944 torpedo boat, slightly smaller than the Type 1941, with similar armament, except that the lighter anti-aircraft guns were to be replaced by 5 twin 37mm mounts, actually capable of firing more than one shot before needing to be reloaded, and the 105mm guns were to be placed in a pair of fully dual-purpose twin mounts instead of 4 singles. They were also supposed to be somewhat faster at 37 knots, but although they were ordered in the same year as their design number, this was notably late in the war, and nothing further was done before the Soviets overran the shipyards. Japan, interestingly, and almost contrary to everybody else, had decided to pretty much abandon the idea of destroyers as a general-purpose platform at the last moment. Whereas everybody else was already building general-purpose destroyers or trending towards that category unless exceptional circumstances demanded otherwise, such as with destroyer escorts, the Japanese devised 4 categories: Type A, Type B, Type C, and Type D. The Type A was about as close to a general-purpose destroyer as you were going to get. It continued the line of pre-war Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer development for fleet actions, and this was the Yugumo class. Compared to the immediately pre-war Kageros, they were broadly similar, a fraction larger and heavier, but only just, with the same speed and the same on-paper armament, except for the two quadruple torpedo launchers being upgraded to quintuple units. The differences were in the details. The overall shape and size of all above-deck superstructure elements was shaped for weight saving as well as less air resistance, thus granting the ship more stability, and the three twin 5-inch gun mounts that made up the main armament were placed in new mountings that allowed elevation sufficient to be counted as true dual-purpose weapons, albeit rather slow-firing and slow-tracking ones. As the war went on, they would gain many 25mm anti-aircraft guns, either in new installations or by upgrading existing ones from twin to triple mountings, though the general effectiveness of the 25mm was such that outside of occasional lucky breaks, they were more useful for putting down sheer volume of fire and trying to throw strike aircraft off their aim, or giving the fighters something to strafe that wasn't torpedoes full of pure oxygen. Of the 19 ships actually built, every single one would be lost, and surprisingly about half to air attack. The Type B was supposed to be an exclusively anti-aircraft dedicated escort destroyer for carrier formations, with the lead and only class being the Akizuki. Compared to the Yugumos, at just under 2,100 tons displacement, the Akizukis were considerably larger at 2,700 tons standard despite having an on-paper, lighter armament of 4 twin 100mm, dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns and a single quadruple torpedo launcher as opposed to 3 twin 5-inch guns and 2 quadruple torpedo launchers. Speed was also a little slower at 33 knots due to the increased size, but having the same 52,000 shaft horsepower output. The increased size and weight was partially down to the fact that the fully dual-purpose twin mounts, despite using smaller guns, were actually heavier than even the dual-purpose 5-inch mounts on the Yugumos, and considerably heavier than the earlier less elevating 5-inch mounts found on earlier destroyers, mostly because these could go all the way up to 90 degrees. Putting 4 of them aboard meant a considerably larger hull was needed to keep the ship stable, while an increasing number of 25mm were also carried as the war went on. The main strength of the ship were those extremely rapidly firing 100mm 65 caliber guns. Over 3 dozen ships were planned, of which 32 were ordered and 12 actually completed. In addition to some joining the war in its last year, the class as a whole proved remarkably survivable for a Japanese warship of the Second World War, with half of them actually surviving the war, and of the 6 lost, only 1, possibly 2 depending on which source you believe, were lost to air attack, and this in an environment where U.S. air power was picking off other Japanese destroyers like it was going out of fashion. Suzutsuki in particular would survive all of 1943, 44, and 45, including a spot in Operation Tengo, the last voyage of Yamato. The class is sometimes split into 3 subclasses, as 2 rounds of design simplification were enacted to speed up production. But their capabilities in terms of firepower and speed remained broadly similar. The Type C destroyer was supposed to be a pure attack craft, heavily armed with torpedoes, but in the end would be represented by a single ship, the Shimakaze. She was also larger than the Yugumos, but not quite as large as the Akizukis, coming in at just under 2,600 tons standard. She was, however, much faster, capable of around 41 knots on a good day, and although she had the same gun armament as a Yugumo, the additional size was used to buy another quintuple torpedo launcher, giving her a total launch capacity of 15. Oddly though, while the ostensibly escort-focused Akizukis often found themselves committed to frontline attack roles, the supposedly attack-focused Shimakaze spent most of the war escorting convoys and other ship movements. Her only real offensive operation was when she was part of center force during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and even there she ended up acting more as a giant lifeboat for the crews of Musashi and Maya, in the aftermath of the earlier Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, which meant she saw no direct action at Samar. She was then sunk in late 1944 by air attack. The Type A, B, and C types all had planned successors, which are sometimes dubbed Super Akizuki, Super Shimakaze, or Super Yugumo, but they're more accurately described as improved versions, since that's a better translation of the Japanese term kai, which was attached to the previous class name to describe the next generation of ships. Due to wartime pressures, most of the improvements in these classes focused on standardizing parts across all types and simplifying construction to both speed production and use fewer rare war materials. None of the Kai types were actually built for these classes, and their overall firepower and speed capabilities would have been broadly the same. That leaves the Type D destroyer. These, like the British Hunt class and the Type 1939s, are right on the edge of what you could consider being a true destroyer, and like the Hunt class, or the U.S. destroyer escorts, were primarily designed as mass-producible convoy escorts. Two features land them here instead. First, their top speed at about 28 knots was put in place because the Japanese Navy designers wanted them still capable of operating with the fleet if needed. Second, their size at just over 1,250 tons standard meant they're in the ballpark of displacement of other full-on destroyers, even if those others are somewhat older. The Type D would be represented by two very similar classes. The Matsu class carried radar, sonar, and just 3 5-inch guns, a single one forward and a twin aft, plus a single quadruple torpedo launcher, and lots of 25mm anti-aircraft guns along with depth charges. While the Matsus were smaller and simpler to build than regular fleet destroyers, they were still in many ways simply scaled down from normal destroyer design. An even simpler ship with the same overall armament, though initially slightly fewer 25mm guns, was designed to succeed them. This Tachibana class was, like the German Type 21 and Type 23 U-boats, designed for modular mass production and did away with the use of more expensive steels. Most of the curves, and almost anything else that had complexity to it, resulting in a somewhat blocky ship that almost looks like a low-polygon model from a 1990s video game, although well over 150 of the Type D were ordered, including many to an even more simplified version of the Tachibana design. Only 32 ships would be completed, 18 Matsus and 14 Tachibanas. 10 of these would be lost, with the remainder surviving largely through a combination of being purely on second-line work or just entering service in the very last year of the war. The U.S. Navy actually has a relatively short entry here, primarily thanks to the first entry in their wartime production list, the Fletcher-class. The Fletchers were some of the best designed destroyers of the time, although far from the largest at just over 2,000 tons standard. They combined a good top speed of just over 36 knots, with a range using steam turbines that the Germans could only match using diesels, plus an excellent all-round armament which in the baseline model consisted of 5 single, 5-inch 38 dual-purpose guns and 2 quintuple torpedo launchers, though initially quite lacking in the light and medium anti-aircraft department. One of the key points with the Fletchers was essentially putting the same kind of armament that had been planned for the immediately preceding classes on a much larger hull. To be sure, there had been attempts to also increase the armament together with the hull size, but with a rather long record of barely stable or outright unstable designs in the 1930s to point to, this effort had been fended off. The result was a fast and powerful destroyer with good all-round defensive and offensive capabilities and an incredible margin of stability, which allowed it to take a lot of upgrades, which turned out to be mostly light and medium anti-aircraft guns. Although built en masse with a total of 175 hitting the water and thrust into the front lines of World War II, mostly in the Pacific, only 19 would be lost, with the single largest cause of loss being kamikaze attack aircraft in the latter part of the war. Prior to these attacks kicking off, only 6 had been lost, 2 to air attack and 4 in surface actions, including, of course, the O'Bannon and Johnston at the Battle off Samar. One of the keys to this ship's survivability was the decision to include a long strip of thicker STS steel along each side. While not belt armor as such, since it wasn't thick enough to stop any actual naval gunfire, it was in roughly the same place you'd find an armor belt on a larger ship, and it was strong enough to stop blast and splinter effects from near misses by bombs and shells puncturing the ship around the waterline, which was the direct or indirect cause of a considerable number of destroyer losses in many other navies during this conflict. However, as the war went on, even the Fletcher-class's safety margins were being exceeded, and some ships were beginning to land their forward torpedo launchers in favor of even more anti-aircraft guns by the time the war ended. After only 2 years of mass production, the last Fletcher would be laid down in late 1943 and commissioned just under a year later. Overlapping this period but itself due for a production run of barely over a year was its notional successor, the Allen M. Sumner class. Slightly larger and displacing about 200 tons more at 2,200 tons standard, the Sumners retained the same power plant, and as a result their speed fell off to about 34 knots. The additional size was necessitated by switching armament from 5 single to 3 twin 5-inch 38 dual-purpose mounts. This gave them an extra gun, which obviously meant more weight, but in addition, the single mounts used in the Fletchers each weighed around 19 tons, whereas the twin mounts came in at just under 44 tons apiece. This meant that although there were fewer of them, collectively the mountings weighed considerably more. But they did occupy slightly less surface area overall, and that allowed the carriage of even more light and medium anti-aircraft guns, in addition to retaining the pair of quintuple torpedo launchers. On average, a Sumner might carry a couple more 40mm Bofors and several additional 20mm Oerlikons compared with the average late-war Fletcher. Late-war replacement of the aft torpedo launcher with another quad Bofors only increased this anti-aircraft firepower advantage. Their other notional advantage over the Fletchers was twin rudders, which gave them greater agility, agility being perhaps the one weakness of the Fletcher-class design. 58 were built with another 12 planned but reordered as mine layers, which were essentially Sumners that had mine rails instead of torpedo tubes. 4 of the Sumners were lost in action, with the class generally proving to be quite tough, as evidenced by the stand of the Sumner-class USS Laffey, which survived, albeit just, being bombed and kamikazed repeatedly during one particularly notable engagement. The reason for the short production run was the switchover to the Gearing class. These were essentially Sumners, but with an additional 14-foot hull section put amidships which gave them more fuel storage and thus more range, which meant initially the armament was exactly the same, just with better fire arcs. A large 152-ship run was planned, but the end of the war saw most of these orders cancelled if they hadn't already been started. So a total of 98 would finally enter service, with some of the earliest ones arriving just in time to see out the close of the Pacific campaign. Their main strength would be seen in the Cold War where, like the Fletchers before them, they proved to have considerable margin for upgrades. The ship's initial standard displacement of just over 2,600 tons was just over 400 tons more than a Sumner, but with no additional use of deck space for armament, and this growth capacity would see some of them last in service in various navies all the way through to the early 21st century, albeit admittedly in a somewhat altered guise. That leaves the Royal Navy, which proved quite prolific in construction of various classes of destroyer, though quite a few were very similar. Back in the First World War, the Royal Navy had built numerous classes of war emergency destroyers, and this time around the same approach was taken. Although the larger L and M class destroyers showed the direction the Royal Navy had wanted to go, it would be simpler, faster, and cheaper to use a smaller hull as the basis for mass-produced ships. Thus, the O and P classes were derived from the earlier J-class hull. The stern was slightly altered and displacement reduced while the machinery was kept the same, which meant the new ships would actually be a knot faster. The biggest change visually was a reversion from 3 twin 4.7-inch guns to 4 single mountings, which also necessitated a slight reworking of the aft superstructure to incorporate the 4th mount. This was because single mounts were quicker and easier to manufacture, and 4 guns instead of 6 meant that 3 of the new ships could be armed for the production time and cost. Gun-wise, of 2 of the full-scale fleet destroyers. The saved weight could be put into more anti-submarine armament and additional anti-aircraft guns as well as radar, which was a relatively far-sighted choice. Another advantage was that with half as many guns forward, you could use just one magazine to hold all the shells, and the other could be converted to carry more fuel, extending their range. In theory, since the overall hull was still similar, especially up front where it was practically unchanged, at some future point the ships could be rearmed with twin 4.7-inch guns to make them near relatives of the J-class. But in the event this never actually happened, additional generators for backup power and electrical heating were also incorporated into the design. Though the rapid growth of systems as the war went on meant the J-class hull would soon prove a little cramped for later iterations of this war emergency type. In theory, the O and P classes were designed to have 3 interchangeable armament fits, which could be hot-swapped in port: 4 guns and 4 depth charge launchers, 3 guns and 8 depth charge launchers, or 3 guns, 4 depth charge launchers, and a minesweeping apparatus known as the Two-Speed Destroyer Sweep, or TSDS, which was designed to be used at high speeds, as normal minesweeping gear could only be used at low speeds. In theory, this would all be supplemented by a pair of torpedo launchers, though these would be quadruple launchers as compared to the quintuple launchers on the J-class and other fleet destroyers. However, initial shortages of supplies and a desire for rapid construction meant the A's and P's would enter service with a slightly confusing array of weapons. Some had 4 single 4-inch guns instead of the 4.7s but kept the 2 torpedo launchers. Others had 4 4.7s but put a 4-inch gun in place of the aft torpedo launcher, since the 4.7s lacked decent elevation for dual-purpose use. Still others had 1 torpedo launcher and 5 4-inch guns, with the 5th gun taking the place of the aft torpedo launcher. The 4.7-inch at this stage couldn't really be used for self-defense against aerial targets, only had 40-degree elevation, which meant at best it could be used to defend other ships, and that was largely the reason for the 4-inch, because that was a fully anti-aircraft capable weapon. All of the vessels also carried a quad 40mm pom-pom and a variety of 20mm Oerlikons. In the next batch, the Q and R classes, some simplification was enacted with steel replacing aluminum in the superstructure to allow the latter material to be used in aircraft production. The hull was allowed to grow slightly, becoming more akin to the N-class in size, though the overall form was still based on the J-class. This accommodated the slight overall increase in top weight. These ships steadied out the armament layout, having 4 single 4.7-inch guns, a quad pom-pom, some Oerlikons, and 2 quadruple torpedo launchers. The R-class displaced a fraction more than the Qs, owing to having a slightly heavier anti-submarine loadout and also being fitted to operate in tropical waters. The R-class would also be fitted for, but not with an aim to later refit them the same gun mounting that the next set, the S and T classes, would have, namely a 4.7-inch gun with higher elevation. Granted, this was only to 55 degrees, so it was still not truly dual-purpose, but it was better than nothing. The use of the J-class hull meant the heavier mounting was quite easily installed on a supporting structure originally designed to support a twin mount. Anti-aircraft armament also changed with 8 instead of 6 Oerlikons, and the quadruple pom-pom replaced by a pair of twin stabilized 40mm Bofors. HMS Savage would be fitted with an alternate armament, an experimental set of 4.5-inch guns, 2 in a twin mount forward and 2 in singles aft, though the former mount, the twin mount, was recognizable as a somewhat modified pancake turret as found on British capital ships. The idea was to test the effectiveness of the 4.5-inch gun as a true dual-purpose gun in destroyers, with a view to the ongoing development of the next stage of proposed true fleet destroyers. During the development of these first 3 pairs of classes, there was also an ongoing argument over the ship's main guns. Some were pressing for 4 twin 4-inch instead. This was usually shot down on the grounds that, yes, it would provide great anti-aircraft cover but potentially considerably less effectiveness in the anti-surface role. There were also discussions about simply purchasing US 5-inch 38s instead, But it turned out that the U.S. gun, at least as advertised to the British, needed more space and weight due to the presence of a handling room below the mount, whereas the British guns simply passed ammunition straight up from the magazines. Delays trying to work out how to fit a decent number of 5-inch .38s into the British hulls, which were slightly longer but narrower than similar displacement American ships, meant that by the time some design solutions were available, Japan had already attacked Pearl Harbor. Outside of arming the cruiser HMS Delhi, the U.S. would not provide any more 5-inch .38s for export in the near future, as they needed them all for their own purposes. The U and V classes would also see the pole masts of previous ships replaced with a lattice mast which was better able to support the increasing array of radar, electronic warfare, electronic countermeasure, and radio equipment that a modern destroyer needed. These would then be followed by the U and V classes, which were essentially similar except for minor changes to the bridge structure and the introduction of twin, rather than single 20mm Oerlikons. The pattern continued with the next set, the W and Z classes, and bear in mind that all of these classes had been laid down in an approximately 3-year period from early 1940 to now in 1943. The W class would be the last to use the 4.7-inch gun, as the Z class introduced the 4.5-inch, which although being fractionally smaller was actually a more powerful and faster-firing weapon, though for now it was simply swapped into the same 55-degree elevation mountings as the old 4.7-inch guns. Due to wartime shortages, many of these more recent classes had quite a mixed variety of light and medium anti-aircraft weapons. Some had Bofors, some had pom-poms, some had single Oerlikons, some had twins, and occasionally there would be a single Bofors or pom-pom stuck on when nothing else was available. Having now run out of letters in the alphabet, the next batch, mostly laid down in 1943 with the exception of Caprice, Cambrian, and Karen, decided they were going to go with names beginning with C. Quite why A and B were skipped isn't entirely clear, but they also got a little picky as this class was divided into 4 subclasses and the names all started still with C, but the 4 subclasses are distinguished by starting with CA, CH, CO, and CR respectively. There was also going to be a CE subclass, but that got cancelled. The CAs were essentially just Z class with very minor alterations, but the other 3 introduced a brand new anti-aircraft fire control system and fully powered mountings for the 4.5-inch guns. This increased displacement to the point that one of the torpedo launchers had to be left off. The last few of this run also abandoned riveted construction completely in favor of all welding, whereas in previous destroyers there had been a mix of rivets and welds. While all this had been going on, the Royal Navy had also been looking at what it wanted from the next generation of true fleet destroyers. Lessons of the war and from various tests, such as the one on Savage, had helped with this, but it had quite soon been realized that a true modern fleet destroyer would be considerably larger than what could fit in many of the slipways of the yards that had traditionally built such ships for the Royal Navy, and so they decided to proceed with a 2-phase program, a true modern design and a slightly smaller one which would be tailored to the maximum size that the smaller slipways could handle. The latter one would be designated the weapon class. Due to the constraints of the building facilities, it ended up not being all that much longer than an emergency flotilla ship, but it was wider and deeper, resulting in an overall displacement of just under 2,000 tons standard. The continued use of the 40,000 shaft horsepower power plant meant that speed would drop on these ships, but this was considered acceptable since they would likely be kept as close screens in a fleet, and they were still more than fast enough for this purpose. The machinery was now laid out in an alternating unit pattern, which would enhance survivability. Larger fuel tanks lent a decent 5,000 nautical mile range, but the weapon setup was an odd compromise. Trying to fit a full fleet destroyer's torpedo armament, a pair of quintuple torpedo launchers, plus the latest in anti-submarine technology, which were Squid anti-submarine mortars, plus a decent medium anti-aircraft fit of 40mm Bofors, plus a decent main battery for surface and air engagements proved to be essentially impossible. The main guns were therefore changed from the planned pair of twin 4.5-inch to first 3 twin 4-inch, and then just 2 twin 4-inch, and these would be mounted super-firing forward with the entire aft of the ship devoted to anti-submarine and anti-aircraft weapons, as well as the torpedoes. Although this was the best that could be done given the pressure to start building, it wasn't entirely satisfactory, and a follow-up class, tentatively labeled G-class with a pair of twin 4.5-inch, one mounted forward and one aft with other weapons appropriately rearranged, were on the drawing board. But these would be cancelled at the end of 1945. This leaves the last ship we're looking at in this story, the battle class. These were drawn up actually slightly before the weapon class, as sheer size was the driver that caused the weapon class to be authorized. These ships would be even larger than the tribal class, and would initially displace just over 2,300 tons standard. In view of the increased threat of air attack, they were to be armed with twin 4.5-inch guns in true dual-purpose mounts, which would end up being prototyped on HMS Savage. The initial sketches had actually been drawn up in the aftermath of the Norwegian campaign right near the start of the war. Due to the increased size of the ship, the machinery would have to be upped in power by 10,000 shaft horsepower to a total of 50,000 to allow them to keep up a reasonable speed. After a survey of the bipedal attack dogs that comprised most of the Royal Navy's destroyer captains indicated that if a heavier dual-purpose mount required fewer guns overall, they would prefer that these should all be up front since that was the direction the enemy was going to be in. And so it was decided to arm the ships with 2 twin 4.5-inch mounts, super-firing forward and no main guns aft. A pair of quadruple torpedo launchers were included along with depth charges, but the aft of the ship was dominated by medium anti-aircraft guns with no less than 4 twin 40mm Bofors and up to half a dozen single Bofors. The stabilized twin 40mm mountings were actually quite heavy, which precluded installing any more 4.5-inch guns aft. At the same time, it was realized that in a night action, if they chose to use star shells instead of, or as a supplement to radar, if they used the main guns for this, it would cut the ship's firepower by half, which was unacceptable. So a small 4-inch star shell gun was installed aft as well. This would be the majority of the 1942 battle class design, but after some further feedback, it was decided to make the ship a little more suited for a surface action. While the Norwegian campaign had emphasized the threat of air power, subsequent operations in the Mediterranean and the early part of the Pacific campaign had pointed out that vicious close-range surface actions were still very definitely on the cards. This would push the 1943 batch of battle class up to almost 2,200 tons standard with the single 4-inch aft replaced by a single full-scale 4.5-inch, which gave a total of 5 guns and meant there was some aft coverage. In addition, one of the twin 40mm Bofors and some of the single mounts were removed, and the torpedo launchers were upgraded from quadruple launchers to quintuple, or in British terms, pentad sets instead. There was also a Squid anti-submarine mortar installed from the beginning, whereas with the 1942 batch they started out with depth charges and then had to be retrofitted. Although laid down in 1942 and 1943, priority being placed on the emergency flotilla ships, which were faster to build, and a shortage of fire control equipment and radar meant that only the lead ship, HMS Barfleur, commissioned in time to see just a little bit of service in the Pacific right before the end of the war. Design work would begin in 1944 for what was tentatively labeled either Battle Class Batch 3 or 1944 Battle Class, which revived an idea that had been briefly floated in the 1943 design to install a third full twin 4.5-inch mount aft. To fit enough Bofors, the torpedo tubes, the Squid launchers, and 3 twin 4.5-inch guns on a hull that could actually go at any appreciable speed required a considerably larger ship, and the arguments that were caused by the apparent size of the new vessel meant that the resulting class of destroyers, the Darings, wouldn't be laid down until just after World War II ended, which thus puts them outside the scope of this story. There you have it, a relatively speaking brief outline of destroyer developments during World War II in the major navies. This does leave a very small number of primarily gun-based destroyers out of the running. The Darings, the Norfolk, the Mitchers and Forrest Shermans, the T-47 and T-53 designs, the Impetuoso and the Scorpion, Nishin, Rimini, and Kotlin classes. The destroyers that slid down the ways between 1939 and 1945 were born from necessity and shaped by loss. Some never made it past the drawing board, victims of collapsing empires and overrun shipyards. Others were built in a frenzy, welded together by hands that worked through air raid sirens and the distant thunder of guns. They fought in every ocean, from the frozen waters of the Arctic convoys to the blood-warm seas off Guadalcanal. And when the smoke finally cleared in August 1945, the destroyer had become something entirely new. No longer just a torpedo boat hunter or a fleet screen, it was a weapon system capable of hunting submarines, downing aircraft, engaging surface targets, and surviving punishment that would have sent its predecessors straight to the bottom. The men who sailed them learned to sleep through the constant ping of sonar, the crackle of radio chatter, and the whine of turbines pushing steel through angry seas at speeds that seemed impossible. They learned that a destroyer could take a kamikaze hit and keep fighting, could dodge torpedoes in the dark, could stand between carriers and certain death and somehow, impossibly, survive. The lessons written in their wakes, in oil slicks and survivor testimony, in battle damage reports and posthumous citations, would shape every warship that followed. The age of the gun destroyer was ending, but its legacy, forged in the crucible of the greatest naval war in history, would echo through the steel canyons of every fleet for generations to come. The destroyers of 1945 were survivors, and they had earned their place in history one brutal engagement at a time. The memories of World War II remind us not only of the price of freedom, but of the strength of the human spirit. Let us preserve their stories, so they are never forgotten. Please subscribe to help keep these memories alive.